Before dawn, the lane is still full of night. The stones hold their coolness, and the air feels thin enough to touch. At the end of the lane, the salt house waits as a low shape against the dark, its walls darker than the sky around them, its roofline quiet and plain. A single lantern hangs near the door, not bright, only enough to find the threshold without waking the rest of the street. Its amber light rests on the rough wall and slips into the cracks between stone blocks, where the old mortar has long since settled into its own calm. Nothing here asks for haste. The place is made for keeping, not for display. Even before the door opens, it suggests order. Weight stored carefully, moisture kept away, boards laid flat, sacks tied close, lids waiting where they belong. The first impression is not of labor, but of care. The dark exterior carries a promise that the room inside will be dry, steady, and honest. In a world where weather can change the meaning of a day, this small building answers with patience. The narrow lane does not bring noise with it. A distant shutter turns once, then settles. Somewhere beyond the lane, water moves in a gutter or a trough, soft as a breath. The salt house remains unmoved by it all. Its shape is simple enough to be remembered at a glance, yet the longer one stands before it, the more detail appears. The uneven edge of the door plank, the iron ring worn smooth by many hands. The line where the roof overhangs just enough to keep rain from the frame. The building speaks in small certainties, and those certainties feel like a welcome in the dark. There's a particular kind of stillness before work begins in a room like this. It is not emptiness. It is readiness held quietly in place. The sacks are already arranged behind the door, the bins already set in rows, the cloth covers already folded where they can be reached without searching. The room does not need to be dressed for the morning. It only needs to be entered. That is what makes the exterior feel so calm. It is the outer edge of a prepared space, a threshold waiting for the right pair of footsteps. In that waiting, the salt house reveals its mood. It is not stern. It is not grand. It is simply devoted to keeping things as they should be. The walls are thick enough to hold dryness. The door is stout enough to keep the damp from slipping in too easily. The lantern is small, but small light is enough when the room knows its own order. Before the latch turns, the house already feels like memory preserved in stone, wood, and quiet air. The opening feels almost like a bow, a slight lowering of the world before it enters the room. The door opens inward with a low, familiar sound, and the first breath from inside feels different from the lane outside. The air is cooler, but it is also drier, as if the room has learned how to protect its own climate. The lantern light spreads over the threshold and finds the nearest stone bin. It does not wash the room in brightness. It only reveals the nearest shapes and lets the rest remain restful in shadow. That is enough. The room should be seen gently, not seized all at once. Inside, the salt house is arranged to encourage calm attention. Rows of stone bins hold their pale contents with quiet firmness. Sacks stand stacked against the wall, their rough fabric softened by use. Wooden boards lie close to the floor, ready to be lifted where needed and returned without noise. Cloth covers rest over certain trays and bundles, not because the room is anxious, but because the room knows that a cover can keep a surface tidy, a grain clean, a stored thing ready for the next day. The place is built around anticipation without tension. The scale of the place is human, but not intimate in the manner of a living room. It is a working room, a preserving room, a room built to keep the useful from becoming spoiled. It has no need for ornament. Its dignity comes from dryness, from measure, from the way each object respects the next. A bin does not crowd a sack. A board does not lean where it could fall. The walking space remains clear enough for a careful step. The whole interior seems to say that preservation begins with leaving things where air can still pass. A closer look finds the surfaces speaking softly. Salt in the bins catches the lantern light with a faint sparkle, but it is not shiny in a showy way. It is matte, granular, and calm. The sacks show seams and knots. The boards show pale grain where hands have rubbed them smooth. The stone floor is cool enough to keep the room honest about its temperature. Each material helps the others. Stone refuses damp. Wood keeps the stored weight from touching the floor too harshly. Cloth protects without sealing too tightly. Salt sits in the middle of all this and keeps its own quiet authority. The room is a small lesson in balance. Too much light would warm it too quickly. Too much air from the wrong direction might trouble the stored goods. Too much movement would scatter the peace that keeps the room useful. So the room remains measured. It is not a place where nothing happens. It is a place where important things happen in a way that does not make a scene. The quiet is not decorative. It is functional. It helps the salt remain what it is meant to be. The whole interior asks for patience, and patience rewards it. The salt house is not only a place that holds salt. It is a place where materials agree with one another. Stone gives the room its heavy calm. Wood gives it workable surfaces. Cloth gives it a soft boundary between the stored and the exposed. Salt itself gives the place purpose. Without the salt, the room would be only a cool chamber. With it, the room becomes part of daily continuity. It participates in keeping food, in supporting preparations that must last, in making ordinary life more dependable from one day to the next. The stone bins are the first sign of that dependence. They do not look delicate. They are practical, squared, and steady, built to remain where they are for a long time. Their sides hold the salt away from the floor and help maintain a clean edge around the stored grain. When a hand runs along the top of one, the touch meets a cool surface, then a dry one, then the slight roughness of settled dust kept under control. The bin does not ask to be admired. It asks only to do its work well. The wooden boards add another kind of intelligence. They are not mere coverings. They are tools of arrangement. A board can divide a stack, support a cloth, bridge a gap, or keep a tray level. The room uses wood the way a calm mind uses a thought, only where needed, never extravagantly. The boards bear marks from use, narrow dents at the edges, pale scratches where salt has brushed across them. Those marks do not weaken the room. They make the room legible. They show that preservation is not a theory here. It is a habit. Even the quietest board seems to know its job. Cloth has its own quiet role. A folded cover can protect a surface from the first touch of damp air after a door is opened. A sackcloth can hold a heavy measure without tearing if it is made and handled well. The cloths in the salt house are not decorative drapes. They are working fabrics, slightly stiff with dry air, sometimes dusted white at the fold where salt has brushed them. They soften the hard edges of bins and boards, and in doing so they keep the whole room from becoming too severe. They lend the room a little warmth without taking away its discipline. Then there is the salt itself, patient and granular. It does not lie in the room like a treasure. It lies there like a promise. It can help preserve what must last. It can stand between spoilage and usefulness. It can keep a small store of food useful through days that would otherwise be too warm, too humid, or too uncertain. This is why the room matters more than its plainness suggests. It is not a storehouse of one substance alone. It is a place where continuity gets its shape. The grain may look simple, but it carries a great deal of trust. Storage in the salt house is an act of thought made visible. A container is opened, checked, and closed again with a care that seems almost ceremonial, though it never becomes ceremony for its own sake. The purpose is simple. Keep the salt dry, keep the surfaces clean, keep the weight even, keep the lids settled where they belong. Each motion is economical. Each motion tells the room that it is still in use and still respected. The room does not need grand gestures. It needs dependable ones. A hand lifts a cloth cover just enough to inspect the tray beneath. The movement is small, but the effect is meaningful. A thin ribbon of air slips over the salt and then is released. The surface remains level. No clumps have formed. No damp edge has crept across the grain. The hand does not linger longer than needed. The cover returns in a single careful fold. The room seems to approve of such restraint. It is built for gestures that know when to stop. Quiet usefulness is enough here. Another bin is checked. The lid comes up slightly, and the sound is subdued, as if wood itself has learned to speak softly here. The contents rest below, pale and steady. A finger brushes one corner of the rim, not to test the contents alone, but to test the room's own condition. A dry edge means a healthy room. A damp edge would call for attention. The work is not dramatic. It is observant. It is the kind of work that keeps a place from slipping into neglect without ever making neglect the main subject. The storage order in the room has a practical logic that can be felt before it can be named. Heavy sacks stay low. Lighter trays rest above. The most frequently used goods remain closest to the opening, while the less urgent stores sit farther back where the wall is cooler. Air moves where it can. Nothing is packed so tightly that moisture would collect without notice. The arrangement is gentle, but not vague. It gives each thing a place, and then leaves that thing in peace. The order feels almost invisible until one tries to imagine the room without it. That peace has a purpose beyond neatness. A room like this supports the rhythm of a household that wants to remain steady through the day. When salt is preserved properly, the work that depends on it can proceed without interruption. There is less waste, less rush, less worry. The room is quiet, but the quiet reaches far. It shapes meals, preparations, and the small certainty that useful things will still be useful tomorrow. It keeps the morning from arriving with avoidable trouble. The hands that work here do not hurry, and that is part of their skill. They know the weight of a scoop before the scoop is lifted. They know the feel of a sack mouth when it is opened wide enough to pour, but not so wide that the contents spill. They know how to spread salt evenly across a tray, how to level it with the side of the hand, how to leave the surface smooth enough to settle and dry. These are ordinary motions, yet the room depends on them more than on anything else. The measured life of the salt house is made from such repetitions, but the repetitions never feel mechanical. Each one is answered by the room in a slightly different way. One day the air is colder. Another day it is heavier. One evening the floor holds more chill than expected. On another morning, the lantern light catches the grain of the salt more clearly than before. The hands learn these changes without announcing them. They listen with the skin, with the wrist, with the attention that only practice can teach. The room teaches back in silence. A small measure is not small in meaning. A spoonful placed where it belongs can keep a stored bundle useful. A cover adjusted at the right angle can help the room breathe without inviting dampness. A lid closed fully, but not forced, can preserve the balance of the bin. The salt house understands proportion in a quiet, humane way. It trusts ordinary hands to make the right choice before the room begins to drift toward trouble. Trust, here, is a working tool. There is also a kind of dignity in the way the work remains humble. No one here is trying to prove anything. The room does not reward spectacle. It rewards steadiness. If the salt lies clean and dry, if the boards stay true, if the cloths remain folded without stiffness from excess damp, then the work has succeeded. That success is almost invisible, which is why it can be overlooked. Yet invisible success is often the kind that keeps a home calm. It is the reason the rest of the household can move without worry. The room remembers those hands. Not in words, but in the surfaces they touch most often. A bin rim becomes polished where fingers meet it each morning. The board edges soften where they are lifted and set down in the same way over time. The cloth fold learns the shape of the shelf it rests upon. The room keeps these traces as a kind of memory that does not interrupt the work. It supports it. That support is one of the room's most faithful forms of care. Near the door, the air holds a different note. It is slightly more active, slightly less still, touched by the narrow seam between inside and outside. Yet even here, the room maintains its calm. The door does not let the morning in all at once. It admits it carefully, so that the dry interior and the cooler lane outside can meet without conflict. That balance matters. Too abrupt a change would disturb the room's quiet usefulness. Standing at the threshold, one can feel the house in two directions. Behind, the bins and sacks hold their steady order. Ahead, the lane waits with its own cold breath and its first pale suggestion of day. The threshold is not a place of decision in the dramatic sense. It is a place of transition managed well. The salt house is always aware of the border it must keep, and the border is part of its beauty. It shows how a room can remain open to use while still protecting its own conditions. The lantern near the door has begun to lose its importance as the sky grows less dark. Its amber circle on the stone floor is still beautiful, but it no longer rules the room. The cool outside light gathers softly at the seams of the frame. It does not rush in. It waits politely. That restraint keeps the mood gentle. The morning is arriving without declaring itself too loudly, and the salt house receives it with the same quiet discipline it gives to everything else. The shift is gradual enough to feel respectful. A hand rests once more on the doorframe. The wood is worn smooth at shoulder height, and the touch recognizes that familiar place without needing to look. This is the kind of detail a room remembers because it happens often and matters enough to leave a trace. In a building like this, the edge between inside and outside is not abstract. It is felt in the grain of wood, in the chill near the hinge, in the stillness that remains inside after the door opens and closes again. Every threshold tells a small story about habit. The cool air at the door also reminds the room why its work matters. The outside world will always bring change. Dawn will brighten. Dampness may gather in another season. Winds will shift. But the salt house responds by holding a measured interior, by making sure that the things entrusted to it remain ready for the day that follows. The threshold is where that promise becomes visible. It is the point where care meets weather and does not lose itself. A room that serves the same purpose day after day becomes a keeper of habits. The salt house remembers the turning of seasons not in speeches but in small adjustments. In a wetter time, covers are returned more carefully. In a colder time, the bins seem to hold their shape even more patiently. In a drear stretch, the room feels almost lighter, as if the walls themselves are pleased by the ease of keeping things crisp. None of this is announced. It is felt, corrected, and carried forward. The memory is practical, not theatrical. The room also remembers the people who depend on it without naming them. The household that sends a hand here in the morning may never speak of the salt house in formal terms, yet its influence reaches far beyond this room. Salt touches food that will be stored, food that will be cooked, food that will travel a short distance and remain useful. Its reach is quiet, but it is wide enough to shape the practical comfort of many days. A single bin can support many ordinary plans. In that way, the room becomes part of a larger continuity. A sack is filled here so that a pantry elsewhere can remain steady. A tray is checked here so that a meal later can be prepared without concern. A lid is closed here so that the next morning can begin without loss. The room does not ask for attention. but it is the kind of place that makes attention possible elsewhere. It is a hidden support to ordinary life. The work inside becomes a kind of trust carried forward into the rest of the house. The memory held in the room is therefore not sentimental. It is functional, and because it is functional, it is dependable. The smell of dry wood, the cool edge of stone, the rough weave of a sack, the fine grain of salt catching light in a shallow basin, each of these things tells the same story in a different language. The story is that careful storage can preserve more than a substance. It can preserve time, smoothing one day into the next with less waste and less strain. The room knows this without saying it. There is comfort in that thought, but it is a quiet comfort. The salt house does not promise abundance beyond reason. It promises readiness. It promises that the useful will stay useful. It promises that work done gently will hold its form. And because it keeps those promises, the room earns its place in memory. Not as a grand chamber, but as a faithful one. The memory it leaves behind is a simple one. Care repeated is care remembered. As the light outside grows a little clearer, the room seems to settle deeper into itself. The lantern glow fades from importance. The dark corners soften, and the bins and sacks resume their silent companionship. Nothing needs to be rearranged. Nothing needs to be discovered. The work that mattered has already been done. What remains is the feeling of order held in place, of a room that will remain ready after the footsteps leave. The stillness is not empty, it is complete. The last checks are gentle. A cloth is smoothed once. A lid is pressed into place and left alone. A board is aligned with the wall so that the opening space stays clear. These gestures do not announce an ending, but they make a restful sort of closure. The salt house is not closing for the day. It is simply releasing the tension that comes from holding attention at the threshold. It can do that because everything is in order. The room trusts its own arrangement. Outside, morning has become a real thing rather than a suggestion. The lane is still quiet, but its cold has begun to loosen. The house remains cool behind the door, its interior protected from the change. That difference between outside and inside will matter again later, but for now, it only deepens the sense that the room has completed its morning duty with grace. The quiet is not empty. It is satisfied. It has done enough without needing applause. A final glance across the room gathers its many small agreements: stone under salt, wood under cloth, air between stacks, light resting lightly on the edges of the bins. The room holds all of this without strain. It is one of those places that becomes calmer the longer it is attended to. The closer one looks, the more its design reveals itself as kindness in practical form. Nothing in it is wasteful. Nothing in it is loud. Everything in it knows how to settle. Then the threshold receives the closing step. The door moves inward until the latch settles. The lantern keeps its small amber promise for a little longer, but the day is already claiming the lane. Inside, the salt house waits in its prepared stillness, ready to receive work again when the next opening comes. Nothing dramatic ends here. The scene simply gives way to a steadier silence. The room remains available to the future without leaving the present behind. That is the lasting impression of the room before dawn, a place where silence is not absence but care, a place where preservation is an everyday habit, not a ceremony. A place where stone, wood, cloth, and salt work together so that the household beyond the door can move through the day without losing its footing. And as morning arrives, the salt house remains what it has been all along, a patient keeper of what must last.